sports, and I have enormous admiration for her as a person and also for the work she does. She is the co-founder and president of Courage of Care. Are you going to say what that is? Sure. And it's a very profound organization, and I've been honored to be a part of that in very small ways. It combines contemplative practice with compassion practice with social transformation and justice work. She has a PhD from Emory University in religious studies and an MA from Columbia in Indo-Tibetan studies. She is interested in practices that transform individuals and transform society. Very passionate about issues of justice and what tools we need to be sustained in a radical way for that work. I started to make a list of, I'm on this board and I'm the consultant for that, Mind and Life and C-Care down at Stanford. And that list was getting really long, and I thought, well, maybe we should let her talk rather than me list all the things she's on. But she's an international traveler, doing retreats, workshops, and consultations all over the globe. Courage of Care has a online training called HEAL, Undoing Oppression, a course for white folks. And I participated in a prototype of that. And it was extremely powerful and really one of the best of its type. So I'm really so delighted and honored to welcome this fine human being.
I love Wendy Farley so much, and I say yes to anything she asks me to do. Morning, everyone. How are you all? Okay? Yeah. Hanging in there? Yeah. It's been a rough week. I wanted to share a little bit this morning about our approach at Courage of Care to spiritual activism and thinking through the relationship between our spiritual work and our social justice work, and how our spiritual practice can inform our social justice work, but also how our social justice work can, and in my communities, may need to inform some of our spiritual work. Is that okay? Yeah. I've always been interested in questions of justice since I was a kid. I grew up in a working class town in Jersey. Anyone here from the East Coast? Yes. Anyone know Bayonne? Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. So working class Irish and Italian Catholic town right outside of Jersey City, and had a sense when I was really young about issues especially of economic and racial inequity and injustice. But my path led me to encounter the Buddhist tradition when I was a teenager, and I ended up through my college years in my early 20s spending, or maybe disappearing in a way, to Asia and studying different models of transformation and awakening from the Buddhist tradition. And in many ways I was kind of obsessed with models of awakening and enlightenment. Like, what were possible paths of awakening? What did it mean to actually wake up, to really see? And what did it mean to be part of a transformed world or community that was actually alive or awake? Yeah. And that path, that obsession really took me back to 8-year-long years in graduate school, where I was studying the debates between different models of mind within different Buddhist traditions, primarily the Tibetan tradition. And I can save you 8 years and tell you that there's not one model, there are kind of many models, and that was one very humbling learning for me that happened over time. But part of grad school, which is actually where I met Wendy, we had been working on different so-called secular adaptations of Buddhist practices, mindfulness-based programs, compassion-based programs, and their application in different settings, like in education settings and in other aspects of clinical and social service. And we spent a lot of time developing what I thought at the time were phenomenal love and compassion-based programs for helping children develop their natural capacity for love and care over their lifetimes. And I thought this was really important work, and I still do, actually. But it was in doing that work that I started to realize that spending all of our time training hearts and minds of young children wasn't solving the systemic issues or issues of inequity or injustice that plagued our education system, especially in the United States. And I also started to realize more than I wanted to admit early on that the Buddhist traditions that I came from, and I'm speaking also from a particular kind of modern, predominantly white Buddhist community that has taken root in the United States, and there's another talk around what that community is, right? But that's just kind of my lens that I'm coming in with. It also became clear to me that most of those traditions had within them a kind of underlying assumption that transformation happened through individual development. That within the modern communities, there was no real sense of systemic transformation, right? That transformation happened kind of inside out, right? And some folks have written about this as a kind of Trojan horse model, that there was some idea that if we just trained up enough kids in mindfulness and compassion practices and or got enough of these so-called spiritual programs into schools or into hospitals or into other settings, we would transform the world and systems of oppression and equity would just fall away. And have you seen anything like this in your own communities? Yeah. And so that wasn't working. We spent a lot of time doing this and that wasn't working. And the turning point for me, so I was growing increasingly frustrated, to be honest, but also curious. Like there seemed to be so much within the traditions for helping us understand oppression, inequity, suffering, and the lack of liberation, that there must be something else here. And so I kept going, but there was a turning point for me. At one point, members of our team were invited to work in the foster system. And one of the key trainings at the time within our contemplative tradition is that suffering happens because of the way we misperceive the world. I see some faces, yeah. And to me, there was a sense already within my work in schools in general, but especially my work within young children in the foster system, that there is no way that I could stand by teaching a practice that ignored, by and large, the systems or conditions that we were all caught in, frankly, right? And so I became really interested in how do we think about understanding structural conditions for love and care, and how do we make that part of our spiritual practice, and how do we, at least within Buddhist communities, really start to embrace that in a more sophisticated way. And I moved out to California a few years ago. I still feel like an alien here, by the way, and began working with a group of educators who were super interested in addressing this question. How do we bring together thinkers in the social justice field, people who are doing really important work in educational equity, with folks on the ground who have also been spending a lot of time working on the development of hearts and minds through various kinds of interventions? And one of my colleagues in this program said this. It kind of just fell out of her mouth in a meeting, and it stuck with me and has become kind of the frame for our work. She said, we're not doing compassion if we're not doing equity. Like, if we're not really taking serious these issues of equity, of injustice, of systemic issues, it doesn't matter. We're not actually doing the good work of changing hearts and minds. And so the question that really enlivens, you might say, courage, or leads Courage's work that I'll talk about in a second, is what is the relationship really between personal and social transformation? And how do we help folks that have spent their lives doing deep spiritual or contemplative work find ways of meaningfully engaging with activists and others of us who have been on the front lines? I've been in so many circles or communities where I feel like there are almost two types of folks that often talk past one another. And there's a ways in which activists see contemplatives as kind of like navel gazers, not really kind of in touch, and ways in which contemplatives can kind of write off some of the movements of social justice workers as if we're not getting to kind of the heart of practice. Yeah?
Would you be able to define what equity is? I'm not sure I know what that is.
Anyone can define equity for us? When we talk about equity, we're talking about creating the conditions that support everyone in their capacity for flourishing and waking up, in a way, is one way of thinking about it. And so that might mean helping different folks get different things that they need to support their capacity to learn and grow. Yeah. Have any of you seen that kind of difference between contemplatives and activist folks, a kind of like seeming divide in some way? This does not run through all communities. There are communities that are much more integrated in this way, I should say. But does that relate to any of you? Some of you? Yeah. So there have been debates for years, even within different traditions and different disciplines. And because I spent so much time in the field of education, I wanted to share a kind of little anecdote from that example. There were folks for a long time who held the frame of personal transformation as the primary means by which transformation happens. And Leah Gordon, who's a researcher at Stanford University, has done a lot of work on early anti-racist movements in education settings. And she found that, especially through the 50s and 60s, predominantly many anti-racist programs focused on individual transformation. This idea that what we had to do was change individual racists or folks who were biased and just change their minds. And that racism happened because there were kind of a few bad apples spread throughout the system, or maybe a critical mass of bad apples, right? And that work happened on an individual level. And her research showed that the individual model, the focus on personal transformation, didn't do anything to address the underlying systems, and most of those, well, you could say all of those anti-racist efforts failed in that way, right? But there's still the kind of shadow of a lot of that work, of the focus on personal transformation as the primary means for even doing anti-racist work actually still exists, right? Then there were other folks who said, we don't change from the bottom up. Like, putting our hopes in changing people's hearts and minds is like, good luck with that. We just need to change policies. We need to change systems, laws, practices. Anyone familiar with the Brown versus Board of Ed? Yeah? Can anyone say anything about that? What happened in the decision?
That allowed for, that broke down separate but equal, and it made it possible to integrate schools, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, it was basically a ruling against segregation of schools, right? And so the idea happens, this massive Supreme Court case that says segregation is illegal against the law. And so there was an expectation that suddenly segregation would stop, right? It took 7 states, at least, many years to even begin to follow the policies implemented by Brown versus Board of Ed. And arguably, many states still do not follow Brown versus Board of Ed. The structures of resource equity, what's being distributed to public schools, you could argue is still not in any way in line with this, and in fact reinforcing the opposite, right? So we have an example from education in which a top-down example also doesn't work by itself, right? So we can't do just bottom-up and we can't do just top-down. So what do we do? How do we think about the relationship between personal and social transformation? And I became really interested in, I found the work of Sally Haslinger really helpful, and she writes a lot about the need to think about personal and social transformation not as an either-or, but as a means of changing culture, that what we're up against is changing ways of being together actually in relationship and in community. That does involve personal transformation, but also involves new systems, practices, and institutional and organizational ways of coming together. And the fact that we are stuck, or at least I'm stuck sometimes, in flipping between, is it personal or is it social transformation, I also think is a kind of feature of our modern context in a way. This idea that we as people are somehow separate from the system or community or context within which we're embedded, right? So in some ways, we're trying to unlearn this seeming dichotomy, or maybe a false dichotomy between people and systems, and try to find new ways of recognizing how our personal and social transformation are deeply and intimately linked, yeah? So my personal project within these Buddhist communities was to think about how might we start changing our culture of practice within these predominantly white Buddhist communities in many ways. And I first started, actually somewhat naively, just starting a bunch of anti-racist trainings for white folks in Buddhist centers. And that didn't go very well, frankly. There was a lot of resistance. And I wasn't aware of the degree to which not only was the rhetoric of personal transformation so strong, but I also wasn't aware of the degree to which those communities had basically inherited and adopted a kind of white supremacy culture, and features of white supremacy were embedded within the tradition in ways in which it had been adapted, transmitted, and begun to be practiced within the states. And the kind of the embeddedness of those features of white supremacy within the tradition made early kinds of trainings really hard to take on. And I realized that what we needed to do was some kind of step back and do some kind of relearning and re-education in many ways. And to be honest, there's the Buddhist tradition, though they're quite lovely, there's been no shortage of scandals in recent months and years. And I don't know, there's like pretty strong patriarchal tradition within some Buddhist traditions. I don't know if you know anything about that. But honestly, for me, I found the work quite difficult at first. And to be honest, I almost gave up. I was finding that the work within those communities was not really going anywhere. But there was something that kind of stuck in my mind, and there was a sense that I had that there were actually so many teachings embedded within the tradition that were not necessarily translated in popular practice, about interdependence, about emptiness, about radical community, about new awakened worlds, about freedom, about collective forms of liberation that were not necessarily the primary means or teachings communicated, at least in the circles within which I was part. And I became really curious in thinking about not just how does social justice now, or social justice work or anti-oppression work need to inform those communities, but in doing that learning, how might some other teachings of those communities also inform and support people in their social justice work? So I became much more interested in the question of bringing or bridging those worlds. And so a few of us, a few years ago, stepped out and founded Courage because we really, frankly, I really did not want to start a nonprofit. I still don't want to run a nonprofit. It's way too much work. But a few of us really felt like we just wanted a space where we could come together as a community and create new ways of being and learning together. And we were struggling to make those spaces within some of our existing communities. And our basic purpose is to find ways of creating communities of practice to help people do their own deep personal work, while also understanding the ways in which they're not only caught within different systems, but that we actively reproduce those, and what might be ways forward. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about our work in just a moment. These are just some of the beautiful people that are part of our awesome team. You'll see our stunning Wendy Farley up here also. We have an interest in interfaith work, so we're multi-faith, multi-religious, intergenerational, multi-ethnic, still working on constantly expanding and growing our family. But our work was about how do we create a community of practice with various and diverse perspectives that we could bring to bear on these questions from our not only our various faith trainings or spiritual trainings, but also our various disciplinary trainings. And so over the past few years, we've created this blueprint as a means for helping people and helping spiritual communities do anti-oppression work, and also helping those who are already on the front lines of anti-oppression work maybe find ways of integrating their own spiritual practice in more sustainable and life-giving ways. So I want to share the blueprint with you, and I'm going to talk briefly through the kind of main points of the blueprint and the main practices in some way as kind of an offering, and hope that this might be some sort of maybe generative guide for you all to play with in some of your own work. And I'm very curious to see if there might be any resonances within your own traditions about this, and when we have time for the discussion. So our blueprint is 5 stages. It's iterative, it's nonlinear, and it's meant to be a process that unfolds actually over time. And we begin with these 5 terms. The first step in the process is love, and I'll talk more about this, but this is the grounding foundation of our work, that if we're not doing the work grounded in love from our view, we might as well not be doing it at all, actually. As we support people in love and helping them learn a sense of connection, reclaim our relationality, and really feel a sense more and more that we're actually in this together, we begin to introduce practices that we call seeing. And this is our introduction to the anti-oppression work. Like, what do we need to see? What more do we need to see? What is really going on here? And as we pull back the curtains, we invariably stir up stuff, or even stir up more stuff. And we built in processes and practices for healing. And also to name healing as an important part of the process. So often we've noticed that as we enter into work together, in anti-racist work, anti-oppression work, some folks, there's a natural kind of responsiveness to move into action without doing necessary healing work, moral repair work, and so on. And we really wanted to claim space for healing work to happen. And then we wanted to help folks not just move into from a space of thinking, what's wrong and broken here and how do I fix it? But how might I also imagine and move into practices of being that help another way of being take shape? Could I envision another way of being in relationship and being in community? And could I envision actually not just my own freedom and liberation, but what would it look like for communities that were really moving toward this in collective ways and really help reclaim people's capacity for creativity? And then action is the culmination of the process, and it helps us find ways of putting our ideas into practice, to really starting to build our own sense of our own kind of culture of practice with ourselves and in our communities. Yeah? So I wanted to talk a little bit about love. I've been reading Bell Hook's book, All About Love. Have any of you seen that book? Mm-hmm. Read any of that book? Yeah. You like it? Yeah. There's so many things to pull out from that book, but one thing that stood out to me is the way Bell Hooks writes about the ways in which we as a culture have kind of lost touch with the art of loving. And that the fact that we've lost touch with the art of loving or don't know how to love anymore, like we've lost that, puts all of our relationships at risk. And those words have just stayed with me in a way. And I think the root loss or the root cause of almost all forms of oppression, racism, sexism, classism, etc., is fundamentally a sense of separation, a sense that we are in some way actually out of relationship, that we are somehow no longer actually fundamentally part of this fabric of the we in some way. And so the model of love that we offer in the Courage Blueprint is a deeply relational model that, in a sense, tries to call us back into our fundamental relationship, our basic way of being in love, our sense that we are not learning to become independent beings who are really good at loving things out there, but we're actually learning to reclaim a power of love that happens in and through relationship, that we learn to love in and through ways that we have been loved, and that kind of love, that kind of relational love, is actually the empowerment or the engine in many ways for our work. So in other words, we're not trying to get a bunch of people to be like really good at doing love or looking good at loving, but really starting to sense their deeper foundational relationship, that we're already held in many ways in a field or network or care or fabric of care. And this way of thinking is actually deeply embedded within Buddhist tradition, and I think there are resonances within other traditions, maybe. But there is a sense in which some of the primary teachings for facilitating love and compassion within the Buddhist traditions are through relational practices, through sensing oneself as loved or seen or deeply worthy by a teacher, by a spiritual figure, by a spiritual benefactor, and by being essentially empowered in and through that relationship to awaken to those qualities of love and compassion. Sound familiar? Yeah. But that foundational kind of frame, I would say, for some of the Buddhist tradition, in many ways got kind of lost or hidden in the transmission of Buddhism into a very particular kind of modern culture with a very strong individualist frame. So the sense that one is empowered into love or in a relationship already got hidden in many ways as practices were taken up within our particular cultural context. So I'm interested in finding ways of reclaiming that foundational relational practices. There's also movement not just within our religious traditions, our spiritual traditions, but within the sciences now, helping us point to ways in which we are already foundationally relational. And just as a little aside, I want to share a little bit of work from one of my colleagues, Jim Cohn at the University of Virginia, who wrote about social baseline theory. And this is the idea that we essentially, as humans, are networked. Like they're not individual beings or brains, we are networked beings. And we feel more at home, at ease, and we are more capable for dealing with life's pains and stressors when we actually have a sense that that network or that sense of community or relationship is strong. So in other words, if we feel alone in our own work and our world, if we feel like our relationships are frail at the moment or really challenged at the moment, it might feel harder for us to deal with life's even just daily challenges or stressors. Can anyone relate to that in their own experience? Yeah. Jim's done a lot of work, it's sort of interesting, where he's brought folks into the lab and had partners hold hands of their loved ones who are experiencing a shock. This is what they do to study relationships. And he found that when we're holding the hand of someone that we love, the feeling of the shock is attenuated or reduced versus when we're alone, right? Some of his colleagues have also done interesting studies where they've brought folks into a lab and had them stand in front of a screen with a huge incline on it. And they asked folks to rate their perception of the incline, like how high was the hill. And folks who had a sense of feeling alone or not super networked or connected rated the hill or the incline as much higher as those who were networked, who had a stronger sense of social support or connection. They also had them wear weighted backpacks. And folks who had a stronger sense of social connection or support rated the weight of the backpack as less heavy than folks who felt that they were alone in the world. So literally the work before us and the challenges ahead of us feel less or are lessened when we feel like there's more of a sense of we. And frankly, we need everyone for this work, right? And we also know that one of the key drivers of burnout is a sense of being alone. There are many drivers of burnout, but one of the key drivers is when we feel alone. When we feel like the weight of the world or transformation is on our shoulders alone, we're more likely to burn out in doing the work. And that cuts across educators, social workers, doctors, et cetera, clergy, and so on, right? And so what can help us really start to reclaim that sense that we are already part of a deeper sort of we? And I think there are sources within many of our spiritual traditions to really help us start to reclaim that. Share a little poem while we're here. Any of you like Hafiz? Out of a great need, we're all holding hands and climbing. Not loving is a letting go. Listen, the terrain around here is far too dangerous for that. So we help people ground in love, and now I want to talk a little briefly about the work on C. And I think the work in developing this capacity for love is a foundation and in many ways a lifelong process for really starting to deepen into that. But we do it also as a way of helping folks start to feel safe, more welcome, more of a sense like we're in this together and taking on some of this anti-racist and anti-oppression work. But we're noticing that as we were doing these trainings, as much as folks wanted to see what needed to be seen, the ways in which we were participating in all of our systems of oppression, there were a lot of resistances that emerged early on, especially as we start to introduce this, especially in predominantly white spaces. And we started calling this work stress shapes, and I'm going to share a little bit about this and see if any of these feel relevant to you. We were noticing that as we started to do work within communities and introducing some anti-racist work, we'd find folks get almost like caught in particular patterns or habits of ways of being. Like there was a way in which some of us could take on almost a shape of perfectionism. And this might look like staying up all night the night before an anti-oppression training and reading everything you can and trying to get all the lingo and definitions down right, or showing up in the meeting and not really speaking unless you knew you had the right answer. Yeah? Can anyone relate to that? Perfectionism? There also can sometimes be a franticness that happens. We get in the room and we start to do some of our anti-racist or anti-oppression training, and all of a sudden, like, the sense of urgency, the sense of like, I can't sit here for these trainings, I can't sit here and do this work, we've got to be out there on the front lines doing the work right now. Yeah? This is not fast enough, people aren't learning fast enough, the world is on fire. Yeah? The world is on fire. Can any of you relate to that? Yeah? Also defensiveness, I don't know too much about this one, but a way in which sometimes, that was a joke. The ways in which sometimes this, as some of this work gets surfaced, or as we start to explore what's really happening here, some folks almost get defended, like we build almost like a wall around our experience. And I like to think of this as like a sense of fear, like we can't handle this in some way. So we build a wall of like this, it could manifest as denial, this is not happening, or defensiveness, like it wasn't me, someone else, right? And this sense like I'm unable to take in information or to really stay engaged in this process. Any of you seen that? Yeah. Or kind of silence. And that could be a kind of withholding. It can manifest from kind of overwhelm, or a sense of people not wanting to say the wrong thing ever, or wanting to look good all the time, so we hold back. And a fear of kind of getting in there in a way. Yeah? Others can relate. Another one, kind of either or thinking that I'm really interested in exploring more, is when we surface up this work, we start to realize the complexity of it all. And many of us are not just surfacing up, we're already in the work in many ways, but it's complex in thinking about what are the solutions to many of the problems we face. And if we're not developing a capacity to be with complexity, right? If we don't feel grounded, if we don't feel safe, if we don't feel like we're in this together, we can pretty quickly feel overwhelmed and default into kind of black and white or either or thinking, like it's this way or it's that way. And we lose a capacity to hold multiple truths, to hold multiple perspectives, and to hold different feelings of discomfort even, right? Like we want an answer, we want a way to fix it, we want a way forward. Yeah? Can others relate to this? And sometimes appeasement happens when we feel like in some of spaces there's expectation that we're going to all feel comfortable doing the work of anti-oppression work, right? And some spaces that pull is even stronger than other spaces. And there can be ways in which if a sense of trying to cater to or take care of, really, those of us who feel hyper set off or triggered by some of this work, right? And hyper-rationality, a way in which we can pretty quickly, without that kind of resourcing, without that sense of being grounded in love, pretty quickly default into rationalizing or figuring out the situation and lose touch with the kind of emotional process or healing process of the work. Yeah? Anyone you notice those tendencies in practice or communities? Yeah. So we spend a lot of time working with folks to help them identify these shapes as kind of a baseline. And our basic idea is we want to move as fast as we can, but we're also noticing that people don't learn well when we feel stressed, right? So how do we create conditions in which people can start to do the work in ways that feel more sustainable and feel more generative in that way? And one of our main ways we like thinking about the lens of anti-oppression is we borrow from Gloria Enzel-Dua's work on Centerlands and Borderlands, and this came through to us also from a Crossroads training we did with folks in Atlanta. I love them, I highly recommend them. And ways of helping people is one simple analysis of understanding the kind of pattern of oppression. Any of you familiar with this heuristic? Yeah, are all of you? Yes, no, okay. So we'll play a little game. If I were to ask you to throw out some identities or features of identity that are centered or normalized or lifted up as good, not that you think that they're good or normal, right? But what's lifted up as good through our media, through our culture, through our education system? What are some features or aspects of identity that are lifted up or centered or normalized?
Beauty.
Beauty.
Health.
Health. Being healthy. Yeah.
As opposed to
Youth.
Whiteness.
Whiteness.
Straightness.
Straightness.
Wealth.
Wealth.
Height. Physical height.
Uh-huh. What else?
physical strength.
Uh-huh.
Intelligence.
Intelligence, yeah. Education, what'd you say? Individualism. Mm-hmm. Extroversion.
A certain image of family.
Uh-huh. You say a little more?
The expectation that everybody has kids.
Mm-hmm. Or married, not divorced. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about gender?
Maleness.
Yeah. Illness. Uh-huh.
Binaries, yeah.
Yeah. And what about spiritual traditions or faith traditions? What goes in the center?
Christianity, evangelical Protestant Christianity. Sorry, I said it.
So some of the, good, what are some things that go on the outsides in the so-called borderlands? Some of them are the opposites of what we just described, but what are some things we'd want to lift up that would be in the margins or the borderlands under this kind of simple analysis?
Queer folks,
Uh-huh.
poverty,
Uh-huh.
people of color,
Mm-hmm.
Disability.
Uh-huh.
Being in migration.
Mm-hmm. Open-mindedness.
Poverty. Blackness.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. What about forms of addiction?
Yep.
Do all forms of addiction go in the borderlands?
No. Caffeine doesn't.
What are there other forms of addiction that are acceptable in the centerlands but not the borderlands?
Consumerism.
Consumerism. Uh-huh.
Mental health or mental illness belongs in the borderlands. I would say to an extent. I think it's nuanced, but
Uh-huh. Yeah. 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 So what is this a description of?
Marginalization.
Uh-huh.
White supremacy.
Uh-huh.
Power.
This is one way of thinking about features of whiteness, and we're going to unpack this idea of white supremacy in just a second. And all of us might, depending on different aspects of our identity, find ourselves in the centerlands or in the borderlands based on different features of our identity. And there are places, this is a very simple analysis, almost like a flattened analysis, but there are ways in which we also might find strength and power in not being in the centerlands in different aspects of our life and community. So we're presenting a pretty simple analysis here, but this is one way for helping us think about what culturally is lifted up and what has the power to be lifted up within our systems. Centerlands is also a way of thinking about access, right? Things in the centerlands, or those who find themselves in the centerlands, typically find that they have more access to resources, education, jobs, opportunities, et cetera, right? So it's a way of thinking about not only features of identity, but also a system, right? Some people have gone to great lengths to describe this system as a system of privilege. Have you heard the term white privilege? Anybody? Yeah. So Peggy McIntosh, her work on unpacking the invisible knapsack, has done a lot of work in helping folks, especially white folks, start to think about and wake up to this idea of white privilege. And Peggy's work, I won't go into it too much because I have a little bit of time, but I found her work helpful in creating a sense of kind of safety, in some ways introduction for folks in starting to understand or think about this idea of being in the centerlands as a form of privilege, as having more access to different forms of resource, right? But I want to kind of complicate that a little bit more. There are other folks who, if we take the frame of privilege, there's a sense that some folks just like woke up in the centerlands one day, and that it's just kind of an accident that there are certain features or kinds of folks that find themselves at the centerlands over and over and over again, and other kinds of folks that find themselves in the borderlands over and over again, right? Like this, oh gee, how did this happen, right? That's what a system of privilege presents. Zeus Leonardo from Berkeley, who does a lot of work on educational equity, talks about the need for us to stop using the language of privilege and start embracing the language of white supremacy, which presents us as a system that we are actively participating in and perpetuating. And he gives this very, I think, moving example. He says, when we think about privilege, if we talk about the system of oppression as a system of privilege, as a system of white privilege, we have this image that there is a parade being thrown in a town, and a bunch of white folks are the center of the parade, and they're parading down the street, and folks in the borderlands, folks of color, et cetera, are simply throwing money, resources, opportunities at the folks in the parade, right? We're just like fortunate that we just receive all of these benefits from the system, yeah? That's what a picture or analysis of privilege affords us. But he says a more accurate picture is imagining that folks in the borderlands had a parade, and they were walking down the street, and centerland folks were standing on the sides of the parade, literally pulling resources out of their pockets, their shirts off their back, their possessions, homes, et cetera. Yeah? That's a more accurate representation of what's happening. That it's not that folks in the centerland just found themselves here, but that it's an active system of literally pulling resources from folks and creating a system in which a certain class or group or identity of folks continues to benefit at the expense of a host of others. Yeah? So as someone mentioned, the way of thinking about centerlands and borderlands is a way of describing white, heteronormative, patriarchal, capitalist system, right? And that features that reinforce that system are found at the center and rewarded, actually, in many ways. And I'll say briefly, I'm talking a little bit more about race in this particular talk, but this is a system not just of dealing with racism, but of thinking about issues around all kinds of forms of oppression, around sexism, classism, et cetera, right? And a way of helping us begin to think about patterns or systems of domination and oppression and the ways they surface up in and through our lives and work in many ways. Sometimes when we do this work, there's a sense that folks have of especially white folks, and I'm speaking a lot for white folks because I'm white, and a lot of my particular anti-racist work with Encourage happens with white folks. But when we start to do this analysis, one of the first responses some folks have, in a really good-natured way, is to think about how they can use their so-called privilege at the center to help folks in the so-called margins, right? How might we reach out to the borderlands and help pull folks into the centerlands where there's more access, resource, and privilege, and so on. Kind of like Robin Hood kind of example. Yeah? Any of you heard this? Yeah. And part of our work is helping us help all folks recognize that in doing that, what we're doing is actually still maintaining the system. And thinking that what we need to do is just help more folks get in the center. What we're not doing is challenging the underlying system itself, right? The underlying structure of the system itself that privileges certain forms of people over another. And so what we need to do is think of ourselves not as Robin Hoods, but as actually starting to dismantle the system itself, yeah? And one question I like to think about, especially within spiritual communities, and Paul LaVelle has written quite a bit about this, the ways in which those of us in social services, those of us who are clergy, who work in education, who care for others, the ways of which those of us in service professions, even out of the goodness of our heart, the way we show up for work because we can't bear the suffering of other folks, right? The work that we do to actually help mediate or mitigate some of the suffering caused by this system, that what we end up doing in and through our work is serving as a kind of buffer class. Any of you heard that expression before? We end up serving as a class that we protect folks just enough from the suffering or the pain of this system, of the centerlands and borderlands, so that we can keep going in a way. And that there's a way in which we can read that as supporting folks, but a way in which we can also be read as maintaining a kind of buffer class that in and through even our service work and even in through our own spirituality, maybe, or spiritual practice, can inadvertently actually end up supporting or reinforcing that system. And so part of our work is helping folks start to do our own personal analysis and our own organizational analysis. Are there ways in which the very practices that we're doing to help mediate suffering and pain, are they actually somehow in the long run actually perpetuating those same forms of those same systems? And we'll come back to this question a little bit later. Does that make sense? So there's a lot. So we don't normally do this in a 15-minute talk. We normally spend a lot more time kind of unpacking this and helping people move through the kind of emotional responses that even show up, especially if this work is even new, yeah? And also, if we've been in the work for a long time, continuing to deal with the ongoing effects of doing this work. And that leads us to healing. We also find that, I mentioned this earlier, that sometimes when we start to pull back the curtain, a lot of folks get to this point and want to act. They want to fix something, they want to do something, they want to quit their jobs, they want to never come to another anti-race training again. I'm joking. And so we realized that we needed to build in practices for actual healing and recognize that we wanted to make space for people to do their own healing and emotional work. And I feel like if we haven't done that healing internally, or if we're not in the process of doing that healing, I should say, for ourselves, it will show up or leak out into our own social justice work. We will very likely bake some of that pain, some of that hurt, some of that unnavigated parts of ourselves into our activism work. So I've been really interested in helping folks, especially within Buddhist communities, start to deal with so-called difficult emotions and do some of the healing or moral work I think that's required of us. I remember a couple years ago I went to an anti-racist training here in the Bay, and I was super excited. I was trying to learn everything I could, and in the first session we got the syllabus, and the instructor, who was amazing, said, "This is no place for emotions. You might feel some things, you might be triggered in here, you can call me after class, but in this classroom we're just going to talk about these texts." And 4 of the 8 weeks were James Baldwin, who talks about healing our moral lives and our moral selves, right? Or calls us to that work. And I thought, how can we be in this space and not deal with our feelings, yeah? There are also other communities I'm part of in which it's not explicitly stated, but it's very clearly or implicitly stated that there are certain kinds of feelings, like anger and rage, that are not welcome, actually, within contemplative spaces. Or that they're signs, if you have or express anger or rage, that they're also signs that your spiritual practice is not so advanced. Anyone ever encountered some of that? Yeah. That really, really makes me feel a certain kind of way. So I've been interested in thinking about how we also learn from some of our traditions in ways of actually working with this emotional energy. I mentioned there's a way in which in my experience, the ways in which the Buddhist tradition has been transmitted here and adapted within this particular white frame has led us to kind of silence parts or hide parts of our emotional life. Like there's a certain way of being or showing up in a Buddhist community that's safe. And it kind of looks like, and I don't do it very well because I'm from Jersey, but it's kind of like very calm and serene. And that's an acceptable way of engaging the work, right? And I've been really interested in finding ways to help folks open up. I don't think we can do this work if we can't get in there and get messy with our anger and rage. And if folks are not angry about what's happening in the world, I also have concerns about their spiritual practice, right? So how do we learn from? There are also many teachings within the Buddhist tradition, and be curious to learn about others, about actually harvesting the wisdom of our emotional lives and using that energy actually as part of our power in our activism, not about hiding it, rejecting it, suppressing it, but actually starting to channel that energy. And there are archetypes of many awakened beings that are not just these calm, serene beings, but that are wrathful and that are rageful and that are training us actually in how to use that energy as a force for social justice and good. And I'm interested in some ways maybe of even like reclaiming that, right? But first, how do we even make space for anger in our... So the anger and rage is one layer, but I've also encountered another kind of block or another area for healing, and that's around shame and guilt that shows up in some of these spaces, again, depending on different aspects of our identity and our location in this system. And find there's a lot of fear or resistance to even feeling these emotions, as if somehow if we were to tip into shame or guilt, we'd spiral into a way of being that we couldn't come out of, or that somehow shame and guilt are bad emotions or feelings. But I like to think of guilt as a reparative emotion. Guilt is something that can move us to act if understood or experienced in a healthy sort of way. And similarly, shame too. Shame can kind of collapse in on itself and lead us into feelings of denial, of attacking others, of attacking ourselves in some way, of withdrawing. But if understood or held in a way in which there's a place or space for holding shame, for feeling like normalized in experiencing it, and supported in doing internal repair, kind of repair with ourselves and repair with our communities and others. Again, shame too, I think, can be an emotion that actually can lead us into some healing, yeah? So I'm interested in finding ways of holding these practices. But there's even a kind of deeper layer that I'm really interested in working on more and more. And that is, I feel, like part of the resistance to doing some of this emotional or healing work in some of our circles is that we've lost a kind of capacity, like Bell Hooks talked about losing this capacity to love. We've lost the capacity to really confront our own kind of pain and suffering, to like really confront what's here. There's a kind of, I might say like a cultural even fragility. And it's partly because of this individual frame, it's definitely because of this white supremacy frame, right? But it's also because of the way in which we are trained to move so fast, to do, to produce, etc. We've lost a capacity to really learn how to be with what's here. And I think this ability is critical for us in starting to do our anti-oppression work. And I think because of that, so many of us may have a feeling of needing actually to hold back from the feeling of it all, for fear that we won't be able to actually deal with what lies beneath. And that might be for some of us anger and rage and a fear of not knowing how to deal with it. For some of us it might be shame, guilt. And for others of us, I think underlying so much of the work is grief. A sense that we've lost something, that we've lost community, that we're losing touch with our planet, that we've lost seeing the full humanity or potential of other people, that we've dehumanized each other, and that also that we've lost realizing actually our own potential. And Abe Latiner, who wrote a piece, Grieving the White Void, for white folks, wrote about this sense of grief that's often, we don't really have great cultural practices for dealing with grief in general, right? But we definitely don't have good cultural practices for dealing with the loss of an absence, for dealing with a hidden source of grief, right? For losing an ability, right? Losing a child, et cetera, and losing or not realizing potential. We don't have practices for dealing with that. And my sense is in doing this work that underlying so much of this work is this deep sense of pain that folks need support in learning how to encounter and also begin to heal. And grief has that energy within it, right? Grief needs to or wants to be honored and acknowledged. And grief has its own process, but I find that the end of grief, like the tail end of the grief process, is this natural energy or urge to reconnect, to restore relationship, actually, yeah? And I think we're cutting ourselves short also without doing that particular kind of grief work. So I'm going to speed up a little bit and just quickly tell you about the last two parts of our blueprint. We're really interested in, as we're doing these healing processes, and again, these don't even happen in a day, right? But how do we move people from thinking that, from a mindset of thinking everything is broken, we just have to do our best to fix it, to thinking some of this is broken, and also within here there's also beauty. Yeah? And how do we start to envision the kind of worlds that we want to live in or be in? And I love this quote from Brittany Cooper, what we build is infinitely more important than what we tear down. And I'm interested in how we move to a more constructive or generative space of doing our anti-oppression work, in which we're not only trying to tear down systems, and in some cases tear down each other, but how we're learning to envision what else is possible and begin cultivating practices to help us start to move toward that in a way. So if we were to all tear down the system today, and it's not that hard to look at the system and figure out what's wrong with it, but if we all had the power magically in this room to tear down the system and recreate something else, are we ready for that? Have we not only just done our own work, but have we really envisioned what we would want to build up? And have we started to put practice in place to start to help that emerge? Yeah? And there are countless practices and teachings within the Buddhist tradition for thinking about alternative worlds, healed worlds, alive worlds, and in many other traditions. And I'm curious about the ways in which our own spiritual training can be a source of support in that. I was struck because not long ago I did a training with a group of nurses, and they were interested in something like radically re-envisioning compassionate caring or something like that, and which I thought was a great title. And as part of the training, they were invited to imagine, they were sitting in teams, that they had all the money, all the resources they needed. What would they do within their health system to meet what they saw were the actual needs? Like, they could do anything. So they had 15 minutes, and they seemed really alive and engaged, so I let them all go. And then we came back, and I asked for a Sharon to hear from a few groups. And the first person that raised their hand said, I decided I would ask for 5 more beds on my unit. I was kind of stunned. I'm like, okay, maybe you shouldn't hear the prompt. So I was like, okay, anybody else? And the next person said, oh, I would ask for a 30-second mindfulness practice to start our team meetings. And then the next person went, and it was the tiniest shift. And we had this Sharon as a community, and almost no one could actually envision something else, in part because we've tried before and everything has failed, the sense of hopelessness, despair, nothing will work, etc., right? Or that we've also lost our creative capacity as human beings and as a culture, and that terrifies me. And this is actually part of the system, to get rid of our own creativity and power for thinking about alternatives, right? And so how do we learn to reclaim that creative capacity, I think, is so key for our work. And finally, as we do this envisioning practice, how do we start to help people act? We all serve something. Every single day we wake up, however we spend our time, in the morning, what we watch, what we listen to, where we give our money to, what we read, what we study, how we communicate, we are all working in service of something, actually whether we're conscious of it or not. And if we're not conscious of it, we're very likely working in service of something we may or may not be in agreement with. Right? So how do we help people become more aware of the ways in which we're working to or toward envisioning this more radical, awake, liberated world. Yeah? And I think part of it is that we need the courage to keep visioning even when it feels like there's no hope. And I'm inspired by the work of Rebecca Solnit. Have any of you read her book, Hope in the Dark? You like it? Yes, I highly recommend it, and I want to read you a short little paragraph. She writes about hope as a spiritual practice. And I think there's great teachings actually within our tradition about this idea that, well, she says it better than I will. Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. When you recognize uncertainty, you recognize that you may be able to influence the outcomes, you alone or you in concert with a few dozen or several million others. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and unknowable, an alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists. Optimists think it will all be fine without our involvement. Pessimists adopt the opposite position. Both excuse themselves from acting. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact are not things we can know beforehand. We may not, in fact, know them afterwards either, but they matter all the same. And history is full of people whose influence was most powerful after they were gone. Hope in the Dark. And her work reminds me of Sharon Welch's work, Ethic of Risk. That was feminist ethic of risk that was inspired by the womanist theology and practice. And the drive of moral life is that we can never know the difference between that which we can change and that which we cannot. Our challenge is to move creatively in a very different sort of adventure, one whose prayer is more like this: what improbable task with which unpredictable results shall we undertake today? So I want to pause here so we have some time for a few minutes. Can we take a minute of discussion? I totally went over this time here. We take 5 minutes of discussion and open it up to any feedback on that, and then we have, I think, some questions for your small groups. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to the parade.
Yeah.
So, like, the people in the parade that you're talking about, there's a lot of white people in the parade because there's a lot of poor, poverty-stricken white people, and I think the difference is that, like, while they're getting their things taken away, the people that are taking away their things are, like, tapping them on the other side of the shoulder and blaming it on the other people in the parade. And so there's a sense of, like, the circle is, like, purposefully creating a divide between people that are in the margins. And so I think it's really great that we, like, have these anti-racism trainings and we do these things in these communities, but we're still all in this big city setting. Mm-hmm. And so what can we do to, like, reach out to the folks that don't have exposure to things like even people of color, let alone, like, anti-racism training? Because, like, as all of this is happening, like, the things that are leading our country are, like, progressively getting worse. Mm-hmm. So do you have any, like, thoughts about how to address that?
Yeah, and I imagine it sounds like you're in the work already here. Yeah. And I think, I mean, I don't have a good answer for you. I have a simple answer, right? Is that I think we all need to remain committed to our own learning, right? How do we keep seeing connections between these different sectors, develop our own intersectional and inclusive analysis and see the connections and understand what's happening on the ground in our own reality? I think that's invaluable information. And how do we start to educate others in our own way? And what might that look like within the communities in which you serve? How do we educate children? How do we make space for being around other folks? Class, race, gender, sex, faith, like, how do we make more spaces for that? Through events, through practices, through communities, in our spaces of worship. How do we do that work? And I think all of that is part of it. And I think at the root of that, what it's really about is starting to actually build relationship in a way. And I think that model of organizing, which I think this is organizing work, right? Those relational models of organizing have been, in many ways, kind of hidden. They're like the invisible knitting work, right? Of, like, behind the scenes, making connections, making people feel a sense of being at home, part of a broader we, don't get lifted up as like the thing to do, or you don't go for a workshop on like how to be in relationships, but they're what sustains the work and what grows the work, right? And so what are the ways or sources that we're actually building authentic relationships within our communities? For me, that's like an ongoing question or direction of inquiry for me. What does it really mean to actually be in relationship? What does it mean to do education or trainings with that relational lens? Like we're not doing this so you can learn and fix my system, but how are we in relationship together to be envisioning something else?
We should probably move to the small groups.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to offer you 2 questions if these support you all. For your small group discussion, what teachings and practices might I draw on from my own tradition in service of this work? And maybe in light of the frames that we shared, I'm curious if there are practices within our own traditions or communities that could be brought to bear on some of this work or be supportive in this work. And are there ways in which my spiritual community serves as a buffer against the system, thereby maintaining it? And so this was about the buffer class question. Are there ways in which, in and through my own service, spiritual practice, spiritual communities, we serve as a buffer that actually inadvertently ends up reinforcing some of these systems?